Good evening, everyone. My name is Ken Howard, and as Director of the North Carolina Museum of History, it is my pleasure to welcome you to our program tonight, our American Revolution Lecture Series, sponsored by the North Carolina Society of Cincinnati, the nation's oldest military hereditary organization. Tonight's lecture, The Future of the Revolution, will discuss the cause of the American Revolution. The Revolution secured our independence, created our republic, defined our national identity, and committed the nation to high ideals that have shaped and defined our history. But what led to the conflict, and what did it accomplish? We'll learn more about that tonight from our distinguished speaker, Mr. Jack D. Warren, Jr., the Executive Director of the Society of Cincinnati. This is the fourth year of our annual American Revolution Lecture Series, and I would like to thank the North Carolina Society of the Cincinnati and its members for their generous support of the museum and its programs. The museum's mission is to preserve the history of our state and educate the public on that great history. Likewise, the Society's mission is to preserve the history of the American Revolution and educate the public on that history. In addition to this lecture series, the museum and the Society have worked together to do many things, including streaming history programs from state historic sites, as well as develop History in a Box kits to help teachers educate students on North Carolina's role in the American Revolution. We are very grateful for the support of the Society. To find out more about our museum, our programs, our exhibits, and how you can support the museum, please visit our website at ncmuseumofhistory.org. And now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Mr. Ples Lunger, who will introduce our speaker tonight. Ples was born a Tar Heel in Marion, North Carolina. As the son of an Army officer, he moved regularly around the United States, but he spent his first 15 summers with his grandparents, Will and Marjorie Ples, at Lake Tahoma. Ples graduated from the University of North Carolina in 1969 and has enjoyed a successful business career. Following the death of his grandfather, the late North Carolina Supreme Court Associate Justice James William Ples, Jr., Ples joined the North Carolina Society of the Cincinnati in 1997. After serving in several different leadership positions, Ples was honored by being elected in 2012 as the North Carolina Society's state president. Since the founding of the Society of the Cincinnati in 1783, the North Carolina Society was honored to have 3 of its members serve as President General, the position first held by George Washington from 1783 until his death in December of 1799. John Davis was elected in 1932, Armistead Maupin in 1971, and William Rayford in 1998. In 2019, Ples was elected President General, becoming North Carolina's 4th member to serve in that capacity. And now, ladies and gentlemen, I want you to pay particular attention to the badge that President General Lunger is wearing. If you've never seen anything like it, that's because there's not anything like it. Ples, would you please do me a personal favor by telling our viewers about the Diamond Eagle? So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ples Lunger.
Thank you, Ken. Good evening to everyone. It's an honor to introduce tonight's speaker, but first, Ken, the Society of the Cincinnati's Diamond Eagle is our crowned jewel. I'm wearing it now, as has every President General in our history. The name Cincinnati derived from the heroic Roman general Lucius Quintus Cincinnatus. He relinquished power not once, but twice after saving the Roman Republic from invaders. The Continental officers saw General Washington as a modern Cincinnatus. Since our inception, special badges are made for the members who would like to purchase them. An eagle is the primary body of the badge because the bald eagle is our patriotic insignia. Also, images of Cincinnatus are centered on the eagle's front and back. The first eagle badges were made by Parisian goldsmiths. The French Navy officers also secretly commissioned a unique badge as a gift for George Washington. In 1784, this diamond eagle was given to Washington as a surprise during the Society's first general meeting in Philadelphia. The badge consists of 198 diamonds, emeralds, and rubies. It's the only item owned by Washington that has been in continuous use for its original purpose, and it's likely the only object that Washington and Alexander Hamilton both wore, for upon Washington's death, it passed to Hamilton. It next went to Charles Cotesworth Pinckney after Hamilton's death. Pinckney decided that it should be the Society's possession of the office of the president, and it passed down through each presidential induction. Well, okay, back to my original assignment. Jack Warren has served the Society of the Cincinnati since 1999 and became our first executive director in 2004. He came from the University of Virginia, where he spent a decade on the faculty and was an editor of the Papers of George Washington, published by the University of Virginia Press. He's been writing, teaching, and promoting American history for most of his life, having submitted his first scholarly article for publication at the age of 13. Over the last 4 decades, Jack has studied and shared the remarkable stories of our nation's past. Along the way, he's won many fellowships, honors, and accolades for his scholarship and contributions to historic preservation. He has published many works about leaders of the Revolution, including a short book, The Presidency of George Washington, which has been praised as one of the most significant interpretations of the Washington presidency ever written. His latest book, America's First Veterans, draws from the Society's rich library and museum collections. Jack modernized this organization, shaping our programs and outreach. He led the creation of the Society's American Revolution Institute in 2014 to promote our historic mission across a broader public audience. The American Revolution knows no greater friend, and he has worked tirelessly to champion its ideals to benefit current and future generations. Jack also happens to be the direct descendant of a North Carolina captain who fought to drive the British from Wilmington in 1780. Not surprisingly, he has a special affinity for the American War of Independence in North Carolina and for those revolutionaries who won the freedom that we cherish and enjoy today. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to give you my executive director, Jack Warren.
Thank you, Pless, and thank you, Ken, and good evening, everyone. Delighted to be with you tonight, and thank you all for tuning in. For most of the last year, I've been reflecting on a question: what will be the place of the American Revolution in the future we are making? History, among other things, it teaches us, if we are prepared to learn from it, teaches us modesty. The future has a way of confounding our intentions and our expectations. It's often dark. The present, of course, is over before we have time to contemplate it. All we really have is the past, what the revolutionary generation referred to as the lamp of experience to guide us. So I don't pretend to know how the American Revolution will be thought of in the years to come, but I have some ideas I'd like to share with you about how it should be understood. For more than 200 years, the American Revolution defined our nation and the ideals to which it's dedicated. For most of that time, the heroes of the American Revolution were the common heroes of our nation. But in the last generation, many Americans have begun to turn away, suspecting at first and then in greater numbers believing that the revolutionaries do not embody the ideals that they cherish. Much more is at stake in the debate that we're having today than the fate of monuments and memorials. The debate and discussion about the nature and meaning of our revolution will go far in shaping our identity as a nation in the future, and the ideals that will shape our conduct for generations to come. On the one hand are those, their voices have been particularly loud in the last year, who argue that the revolutionaries did not go far enough or fast enough to fulfill the ideals of equality that they expressed so powerfully in the revolution. Some go farther and argue that the revolutionaries did not indeed believe in equality and simply used the rhetoric of universal natural rights to justify a political movement intended to impose deeper and more lasting forms of inequality. On the other hand are those that insist the revolutionaries created a remarkable political and constitutional order that facilitated the development of a free, wealthy, and powerful nation, which has, through gradual and at times dramatic moments of reform, provided for equality before the law and equality of opportunity for an increasing number of its citizens, while acknowledging that the men that they call the Founding Fathers were imperfect. They insist that we judge them in the context of their time, a time in which inequalities were commonplace. Their opponents are equally determined to stand in judgment of those same founders, finding them wholly inadequate and unworthy of admiration because they did not live according to the standards of our time. Now, both parties, I think, and those shades in between, there are plenty of shades in between, but for the last year we've really only heard the loud voices on one side or the other. I think they misunderstand the revolution. Although they have little in common, people on both extremes look on the revolution as a political, legal, and constitutional event. A political, legal, and constitutional event, and pay little attention to the revolution as a social and cultural one. And it'd be my argument tonight that it's the social and the cultural that we need to pay most attention to, because they help to define the revolution's consequences and its purpose in our national history. Now, to understand the revolution, we need first to understand what we mean by the American Revolution. And I know that's a very broad question, but there are people who can help us, and perhaps no one better to lean on in this sense than John Adams, who was, I think, certainly the most thoughtful revolutionary we've ever had. And he lived long enough to have a historical perspective on the events through which he had lived and in which he had played such a major role. Now, Adams thought the American Revolution began, he said, at the end of the French and Indian War, when the British began asserting themselves as never before in colonial affairs and extended through the Declaration of Independence. Now, Adams regarded the revolution as a change in the sentiments of the American people involving alienation from the British monarchy and the adoption of republican principles of government, which Adams said had occurred before the war began. That, Adams said, was the real American Revolution, and it had taken place largely by 1776. Now, before we dismiss that, give Adams his due. There's some merit to this argument. For Adams, the rejection of monarchy in favor of an experiment in self-government was what made the American Revolution so remarkable, indeed unprecedented. And he was right in that sense. In 1775, nearly everyone on earth was the subject of a monarchy, and true self-government existed only in the theoretical speculations of philosophers and coffeehouse radicals. While thoughtful people of subsequent generations would agree that the revolution began before the war, few of us would share John Adams' view that the American Revolution was almost over before the war began. This is, at least in part, because our generation doesn't readily grasp how radical the rejection of monarchy was in 1776. We live in a world in which most of the world's governments are at least nominally republics, including governments like that of the People's Republic of China that share few of the characteristics we associate with republics, except that they aren't hereditary monarchies. And at the same time, those states that, like Great Britain, describe themselves as constitutional monarchies are, in fact, republics in practice. The United States was the first modern republic, and the success of our revolution and the republic that we created as a consequence of it encouraged the world to follow our example. Much of the world did, and now the accomplishment no longer seems particularly radical. And in this sense, the American Revolution succeeded beyond the expectations of its most enthusiastic supporters. Except that, as we all know, many of the self-described republics of modern times are in fact some of history's most vicious and sordid tyrannies. The idea that humankind should be governed by republican principles has triumphed. But the reality remains much as it was when Rousseau challenged the world. Mankind was made to be free, but is everywhere in chains. If being true to the most fundamental ideals of our revolution ever mattered, it matters now, when tyrants stalk the world falsely claiming to represent sovereign people they routinely oppress and even brutalize. It matters what our revolution means, and it will matter in the next century. We know from experience that what happens after a monarchy or a despotism is overthrown matters as much as that single act of rebellion. In the 250 years since our revolution, monarchies have been overthrown all over the world, replaced in many cases, sadly, by autocrats, dictators, or military governments. Now, Adams was wrong about when the revolution happened because he did not fully grasp the revolutionary consequences of the war. For him, it was the war that followed the revolution. But in fact, the war was an intrinsic part of the revolution. This has become less and less appreciated in the popular mind in recent decades. And I think this is a source of a serious problem in how we understand the revolution. The Revolutionary War seems small to many Americans when compared to later wars. Its battles seem like mere skirmishes in comparison, its death toll paltry, its suffering minor, its sacrifices modest. We are easily deceived by the war's scale. It was, in fact, until the interminable undeclared wars of modern times, the longest war in American history. It touched every part of the new nation from Maine to Florida and west to the Mississippi, and brought sadness and sorrow and loss to many thousands of families and to every community. In proportion to the population, it took the lives of more Americans than any other war in our history, except for the Civil War, which really doesn't count because it's a war in which the losses on both sides have to be figured. The Revolutionary War was itself a civil war that set brother against brother, often literally, and it degenerated into a partisan war between loyalists and patriots nowhere more viciously than in North Carolina. It was a traumatic event punctuated by episodes of extraordinary courage and also by remarkable brutality. The war mobilized an extraordinary number of Americans, as soldiers, of course, but that's the simple part. Many more as laborers, sailors, craftsmen, people in every walk of life. It had a dramatic effect on the lives of women, many of whom lost husbands, sons, brothers, fathers. Many more were forced to manage for themselves and do work that they would never have had to do in peacetime. And in that sense, it bears comparison with later wars, and particularly with the wars of the 20th century. And some of whom, something unique in our history to the American Revolution, many of them followed the army on the march and in camp, and a few even in battle. It also had an enormous effect on the lives of the enslaved. Many of them took advantage of the war to free themselves, running away, serving in or with the army as soldiers, laborers, or servants, bringing suit for their freedom, as they did in some New England states, and taking advantage of the first statutes abolishing slavery ever adopted anywhere in the history of the world. Now, little of this would have happened if the American Revolutionary War had been brief, if, like so many revolutions the world has seen in the last 50 or 100 years, if it had been a kind of brief coup, something that only took a few weeks or months. if, as many patriots had hoped, the war had ended when the British evacuated Boston in the spring of 1776, never to return. But that didn't happen. When George Washington took command of the Continental Army in June of 1775, he had implied in a letter to his wife Martha that he would be home by Christmas. Now, that was undoubtedly wishful thinking, and he knew that, but he never imagined that 7 Christmases would come and go, and that he would not reach Mount Vernon until the eve of the 8th. A war of that scale, fought in every part of the country over such an extended period of time, was bound to transform people's lives. And the Revolution did that. To understand how deeply it affected people's lives, we have only to read some of the thousands of pension declarations veterans made 50 and more years after the war ended. I mean, it wasn't until 1819, and then in 1832 that the United States government passed pension laws benefiting the veterans of the American Revolution. And as historians, we have to be very glad that they did, because they required veterans to come into a courthouse and make a declaration about their service. Most of them had long since lost their discharge papers. Most of them had no evidence that they'd served. And of course, state records were fragmentary. So they had to come in and swear to a declaration, to a statement explaining their service. And this forced thousands, tens of thousands of Americans seeking pensions to explain what they had done during the Revolution. And occasionally they tell us not only what they did, but what they thought. It's quite an extraordinary body of evidence, and there are tens of thousands of these things. They're readily available to you, and you can read as many of them as you like online. Now, for most of those veterans, the war had been a singular event in their lives, never to be forgotten. The recollections they gave in 50 and 60 years after the war are often quite vivid. Many of those veterans bore physical scars from the war, and for many more, the war was an upheaval that lifted their lives out of the course it would otherwise have followed and set them on an entirely new path. We will never understand the Revolution until we understand it in these terms, the effect that it had on the lives of the people who participated in it. I could multiply examples out, and I'll share some with you because I find them all very compelling. Jesse Stout, a New Jersey farmer, served for most of the war. He was shot through the shoulder, entirely through the shoulder in 1777. After recuperating, he returned to service, though he didn't have to. After the war, he moved to Pennsylvania, then back to New Jersey, and in 1795, he moved off to Ohio, spent 7 years in Indiana, and then finally settled toward the end of his life in west central Illinois. Such an odyssey would have been unimaginable before the Revolution, when most people born in what became the United States lived out their lives within 50 or 100 miles of the place they had been born. But there was nothing unusual about Jesse Stout's case. Thousands of Revolutionary War veterans moved west or south or north after the war. The population of the United States in the generation after the American Revolutionary War seemed to be charged with a restless energy. When the American Revolution began, the colonists nearly all lived within 200 miles of the Atlantic Ocean, and most lived within 50, as earlier generations of colonists had done. The Revolution changed that forever. The graves of the men and the women of the American Revolution are scattered over nearly half a continent. And this is a physical fact and quite extraordinary. John Abstam of Pittsylvania County, Virginia, was 19 when he fought at the Battle of Kings Mountain. He moved to Kentucky after the war and settled finally in Texas. Charles Polk of Mecklenburg County, the Polk's a great Mecklenburg County family name, was a teenager when he served in the defense of Fort Moultrie at Charleston in 1776. He survived the war, then got married, settled in Tennessee before he moved to Texas. This one I like. Stephen Taylor served for 3 years in the Massachusetts Continental Line, moved around upstate New York after the war, lived for the last years of his life in the Minnesota Territory, a region barely mapped when the Revolutionary War began. The war was a defining experience for people who never strayed even far from home. Marmaduke Maples, I'll confess, that's a funny sounding name. Marmaduke Maples of Lincoln County, North Carolina, enlisted in the Continental Line in January of 1777, and then later agreed to serve for the duration of the war. He fought with Washington's army at Brandywine and Germantown and Monmouth, where he's mentioned in several letters with distinction for courage. He was captured at Charleston when it capitulated in June of 1780. And then he was imprisoned for nearly 2 years, much of it on a prison hulk moored in Charleston Harbor, where the suffering of American prisoners prefigured the suffering of Union soldiers at Andersonville during the Civil War, except the prisoners at Charleston, like those who were packed into the hulks in the East River off New York City, they starved within sight of cities where food was abundant. Their miserable lives punctuated by daily ritual in summer heat and winter's cold of burying their dead comrades who died daily in shallow graves scooped from the mud next to the ships. Most of the men Maples served with died on those prison hulks, or to escape them agreed to serve with the British Army as their only means of escape. Now, Maples was offered the opportunity to serve in the British Army, and he refused. Malnourished and sick, he managed to survive until he was exchanged in 1782, when the British loaded him and the remainder of his regiment on a transport and dumped them in Jamestown, Virginia. They somehow managed to march back to Hillsborough, North Carolina, where they were captured by raiding loyalists in September 1782. Maples was so close to death that the loyalists who captured him paroled him. He was still on parole in early 1783 when he mustered with other North Carolina soldiers at Cross Creek, now where Fayetteville is today, expecting to rejoin the army, and he was there when peace was declared. He didn't have to do that. He could have gone home. At several points in this odyssey, Maples could have escaped the army, but he kept returning to service, and it seems unlikely that he did so to obtain bounties which actually were never materialized. The inescapable conclusion is that he was committed to that cause. After the war, he went home to Lincoln County, where he taught school. He was a very literate man. He lived for another 60 years, and when he was too old and broken down to support himself any longer and applied for a veteran's pension, his neighbors testified, one after another, that it was well known in the neighborhood that he had been a brave soldier of the Revolution and shared in its greatest battles. He was deeply honored by the people with whom he lived. The remarkable thing about his story is how unremarkable it was. David Dorrance, a Connecticut captain, joined the army shortly after Bunker Hill and fought in some of the war's fiercest battles. In 1781, he was shot by Tories through his right hip while leading a raid in Westchester County, New York, in what is now the Bronx. He recovered enough to return to regular duty and served until the end of the war, and he carried a musket ball in his groin for the rest of his life. At 60, he was so incapacitated that he could barely walk except with great effort and pain. The early republic was filled with men with stories like this. At the close of the struggle, a perceptive observer in the 19th century wrote, nearly every adult male had been a participator in its scenes. The consequence was that of those scenes, in the form of a husband, a father, or a son, or a brother, a living history was to be found in every family. A history bearing the indubitable testimonies of its own authenticity in the limbs that were mangled, in the scars of wounds received, in the midst of the very scenes related. A history, too, that could be read and understood alike by all, the wise and the ignorant, the learned and the unlearned. And the perceptive observer was Abraham Lincoln. The war made the American Revolution a people's revolution. We don't see that as clearly as we should. We have a tendency to think of our revolution as an event dominated and driven by a group of people we call the Founding Fathers, or sometimes simply the Founders. This is a group of men, all of them white, most of them wealthy, who were most active in the creative state building of the revolution. They were mostly very conscious that they were participating in one of history's great events, and many cultivated reputations for unselfish public service. Some of them, Washington, Franklin, Jefferson, John Adams, most clearly among them, recognized that they were historic figures, and they saved their papers for us to read. They wanted us to remember them, and we do. Our fellow Americans don't see the other revolutionaries, the ordinary men and women for whom the revolution became a transcendent and transforming cause as clearly. Their revolution was one of the defining events of modernity, but an odd coincidence. It was over a few decades before the invention of photography, one of the defining technical inventions of modern times, which makes it possible for us to see the faces of ordinary people who fought, say, in our Civil War, who protested for women's rights, who suffered in the mines and the slums, who labored in the mills, and who bore the scars of slavery. We can see their faces and easily imagine them as men and women like us, but not so the ordinary people of the American Revolution. They are mostly faceless to us, nor did they leave us with a large body of personal writings to make up for this visual deficiency. Problem for historians and for historical memory is that they weren't romantics, capital R romantics. They didn't spend a great deal of time thinking about themselves. They wrote some about their experiences, but rarely about their feelings. They share ideas, but not emotions. Their diaries are usually spare and very unrevealing, none more so than George Washington's diary. Washington will tell you, who he dined with and what he ate, but he doesn't tell you what he thinks. And personal letters of the revolutionary generation are not generally much better. Just occasionally, we get a glimpse of their emotional lives through the veil of reserve that they naturally maintained. Aquila Cleveland was a young private in a New Hampshire Ranger Company when he wrote to his wife Mercy on June the 10th, 1777. His company had been patrolling the west shore of Lake Champlain in New York for 60 miles north of Fort Ticonderoga, but had seen only one Indian scouting party. They weren't worried. They had no reports of British movements to the north. By what we heard, H-E-R-D, Aquila was not much of a speller, by what we heard, they will not trouble us here this summer. He had no idea that a British army was descending on them. He was more worried about smallpox, he told his wife, which loyalists, he claimed, were trying to spread among American troops. Food was expensive, so he grumbled about that. And the promised recruitment bounties remained unpaid, so he couldn't send her that money. All of this was the workaday prose of an ordinary soldier. But then he closed. My dearest wife, after my regards for you, I don't know what I shall say to you. I don't know when I shall see you, but would have you do as well as you can. Remember that God is able to support you now as ever if you trust in him. I shall come home as soon as I get a chance, and so I remain your loving husband till death. That's a rare degree of emotional revelation for an 18th century person. A week later, on June the 17th, 1777, Aquila Cleveland was killed by a party of Mohawks sent south by the British in advance of Burgoyne's army. Well, why did they do it? Why did they risk their lives and give their lives in our Revolutionary War? These are essential questions, and one of the basic flaws of the present overheated public dialogue about the American Revolution is that the people participating in that dialogue aren't asking those questions. Why did they do it? Why did they risk their lives? Why did they give their lives in this war? At the level we need to be asking these questions, the documents sometimes fail to give us clear answers, but the record is not silent. If we understand the context in which ordinary people acted, we can infer their motives, even when they don't tell us explicitly why they do what they do. Margaret Corbin was a young and recently married woman in her early 20s when the war began. She lived in Franklin County, Pennsylvania, in the wooded hills west of Gettysburg, though that town was only just founded. It had been founded when she was 10 years old, and its terrible moment was more than a century away. Margaret's father was killed when she was a little girl by the Indians And when her mother was carried off by the same Indian raiding party and mother was never heard from again, she went to live with an aunt and uncle. And at 21, she married a local farmer. A couple of years later, when the Revolutionary War began, her husband, John Corbin, enlisted in the 1st Company of the Pennsylvania Artillery. Now, men like John Corbin did not read treatises on natural rights or political economy like John Adams and Thomas Jefferson did. Women like Margaret Corbin certainly did not. Few of them had ever heard of John Locke or Baron Montesquieu or ancients like Cicero. Nor, in fact, did they worry too much about taxation, taxes on paint, paper, lead, tea, glass. Those were the Townsend duties that so upset merchants of this period. They didn't matter to people like John and Margaret Corbin because they didn't buy paint. They didn't live in painted houses. They didn't drink tea. They didn't use much paper, and for them, lead was something you cast into bullets, not something that you used to hold window glass in your windows, which is why the British taxed it. Men and women who lived in the colonial backcountry valued their independence. They had little property. In the Corbins, Pennsylvania, where the law was very generous to squatters, certainly more so than elsewhere, many lived on land to which they had no clear title. In North Carolina, the law was written to benefit a distant, indolent English aristocrat rather than the ordinary people, and denied many people the simple opportunity to buy the land on which they lived, even if they could afford to buy it. What little such people had, and their inventories tell us they had a bedstead, a few pots, a gun, belonged to them. And there was no squire, as it would be in England, there was no squire to whom they owed obedience or to whom they had to pay rent. If they liked it, they could go, they could join the constant movement southward through the Great Valley or press westward toward the Appalachian frontier where the British had just drawn a line forbidding settlement, a symbol of their intention, or so Americans across the colonies and up and down the social scale believed, to impose much tighter control on their restless, unruly subjects. These were people to whom independence was not a philosophical abstraction. It was a personal cause. And when they spoke of independence, they meant personal independence as much or more than they meant national independence. When John Corbin went off to war, Margaret went with him and supported herself doing laundry, mending clothes, cooking, nursing the sick. George Washington didn't like women following the army, but he tolerated the practice, allowed the women to draw rations. And the truth is that nearly every moment of the Revolutionary War, women were present. On November the 16th, 1776, John Corbin's battery was stationed on a ridge on the northern end of Manhattan, which the British and Hessians had to take before approaching Fort Washington, which was the last American stronghold on Manhattan Island. John Corbin was killed during the attack, and Margaret, who was probably carrying water from a nearby creek to swab out the guns, Margaret was nearby and took his place on the gun crew. Within a short time, she fell hideously wounded as the battery was overrun by Hessians, hit in her left shoulder and arm, her jaw, and her left breast. She was captured, though probably in so much pain that if she was indeed conscious, that she can hardly have cared about falling into the hands of the enemy, who didn't know quite what to do with her and so released her. She was taken by wagon from New York to Philadelphia. I invite you to imagine what that must have been like for her, where she languished for months. Margaret Corbin's story reminds us, and we clearly need reminding in this country these days, of the extraordinary lengths to which men and women of the revolutionary generation went to establish their independence, their personal independence. Perhaps if we had her photograph, perhaps we would not be so quick to abandon the memory of her generation of ordinary people, but we don't. Forgetting Americans turned her sacrifice and that of other women like her into a genteel fantasy, the mid-19th century fantasy of Molly Pitcher, who we see in paintings and prints, a lady in a hoop skirt out on a battlefield, something that never occurred. And our generation, so certain of its sophistication, so cynical, dismisses this as a myth, but in another form, it's not a myth at all. If we had her photograph, we would know her. We would know her as a disfigured and scarred young woman who lived on, permanently disabled, drawing rations at West Point for the rest of her life, finally buried when she died at 48 in a grave that has long since been lost to memory. She paid the cost of liberty. She paid it, in doing so lost the personal independence that she was probably fighting to maintain or secure for herself, her husband, and the family that she never had. Compared to stories like these, the kinds of debates that we have, uninformed by the experience of ordinary people, seem hollow. We often do, tie ourselves in intellectual knots, trying to understand what we call the original intent of the revolutionaries who drafted our first Constitution and the laws under which we live. These are indeed useful. There are many insights to be gleaned from the reflections of Adams and Jefferson, Madison, Hamilton, Jay, people who left their papers for us to read. But it's at its most fundamental, the American Revolution was a struggle for self-government, to vindicate the rights of ordinary people to manage their own affairs. And the theoretical speculations of the most sophisticated founders tells us little that we cannot learn from the simple explanation offered by Captain Levi Preston of Danvers, Massachusetts, who, decades after the Revolution was over, explained that the war had explained that what we meant in going for those redcoats was this: we always had governed ourselves, and we always meant to. They didn't mean that we should. That same intent, independence defined as personal autonomy, self-government as a people and as individuals, is woven through the words and deeds of innumerable ordinary people who lived through our Revolutionary War. Among them was Jeffrey Brace. Jeffrey was a native of Mali, enslaved as a teenager, beaten and abused by a succession of masters in the Caribbean and later in Connecticut, who enlisted in the Continental Army with a promise of freedom at the end of his service. When he was finally discharged in the summer of 1783, he was awarded the Continental Army's Badge of Merit. Thus was I, he remembered later, a slave for 5 years fighting for liberty. We can know his story because almost 30 years after the war, he told it to a young lawyer who wrote it all down. By that time, Jeffrey was blind. His blindness probably brought on by years and years of brutality he had suffered. Like so many others, he had fought in the Revolutionary War for his own personal independence. The first time I made a bargain as a freeman for my labor, he said, after the war, was the most memorable day of my life. I enjoyed the pleasures of a freeman. My food was sweet, my labor a pleasure, and one bright gleam of life seemed to shine upon me. It's one of the tragedies of the debate of the last year that we now take it for granted that African Americans did not have a passionate commitment to this fight, that they were not deeply committed to the patriot cause. As somewhere between 5,000 and 9,000 African Americans served in the Continental Army or with American troops, either as soldiers or as laborers, as volunteers, as servants, as privateers. Their service and their sacrifice and their commitment to the cause of independence was deep and palpable. Perhaps no more powerful commitment to independence and to equality, to the idea of equality, than any other American. They have reminded us, they and their children and their children's children have reminded us of the revolutionary commitment to equality. They claimed it, they held it as tightly as any American. Now, if you carry only one idea away from tonight, I hope you will take more than one, but if you take only one, it is the achievement of the American Revolution were not just the achievements of a small group of men we call the Founding Fathers. They were thinkers and leaders, creative statesmen, to be sure, but their achievement, the achievement of the American Revolution, are actually the common achievements of thousands and thousands of people The leaders we remember most clearly played essential roles, but often that role was simply to articulate in declarations, in constitutions, in bills of rights, in laws, learned essays, and popular polemics, ideas that were being expressed, churning through society in varying ways and to varying degrees of precision, sophistication, by thousands of people. Leaders have to lead. And the essence of leadership is a balance between fulfilling the ideas and expectations of the people led and expressing new ideas and translating those new ideas into action. The first part is critical because the hope of seeing their ideas and expectations fulfilled is the reason people embrace leaders. And a leader without followers is just someone out taking a walk. Philosophers had been talking about natural rights and what we come to call civil rights for more than a century when the Revolutionary War began. Political thinkers had concluded in weighty books that they circulated among one another that a republic was, in theory at least, the best sort of government. It took action by real people, by ordinary people, to make those things real. Thomas Jefferson didn't vindicate our natural rights. James Madison and Alexander Hamilton didn't give us our republic. They were taken for us. They were taken for us by Charles Polk and Aquila Cleveland and Margaret Corbin and Jeffrey Brace. They were taken for us by the officers and men of the Continental Army who scorned a military takeover at the end of the war. They were taken for us by thousands of ordinary Americans who became our first veterans, who went home at the end of the 8 years of war unpaid, with promises made to them by government unfulfilled, mostly penniless, many in rags, but conscious of duty faithfully performed in a war of national liberation. They made possible for the first time governments based on the principle of popular sovereignty and limited by devotion to the rule of law and limited by constitutional principle to prevent governments from invading the legitimate rights of the people. Thomas Paine had, the most popular writer of the Revolution, Thomas Paine had told them to expect independence to come at a very high price. What we obtain too cheap, Paine wrote, we esteem too lightly. It is dearness only that gives everything its value. Heaven knows how to put a proper price upon its goods, and it would be strange indeed if so celestial an article as freedom should not be highly rated. Independence, the accomplishment of 8 years of desperate war, the shared accomplishments of thousands of ordinary Americans, made possible all that we have become. Independence. Their legacy led, despite the misgivings of the founding fathers about democracy, to the development of a liberal democracy in which ordinary people participated to a degree the founders never imagined or foresaw. The People's Revolution, you see, confounded their expectations and left us with a government republican in form, but popular in practice, with constitutional boundaries preventing the popular will from invading individual rights. The very autonomy, the personal autonomy, the thousands of people who made the revolution, the people rightly described as founding fathers and founding mothers, and they are innumerable, that they had fought to achieve. The war created a nation where none had existed before, a nation based not, as all of the nations which preceded it, on ethnicity, religion, or some ancient tradition extending into the mists of time, but on shared principle and shared history. I want you to hold on to that thought. Our national identity, which flows from the American Revolution, is based on shared principles and shared history. It's not based on ethnicity, religion, or ancient tradition. If we don't have a true shared history, if we don't have common principles shared by all Americans, we have no nation at all. It's a shared history that involved heroic leaders like George Washington, but also heroes fit for a democratic republic. Sergeant Jasper, the hero of the attack on Fort Moultrie in 1776, the sort of epic Sergeant York or Audie Murphy hero of the Revolution in the South. Peter Francisco, a Virginia hero of the Revolution, a big, burly, ordinary man, along with 18th century gentlemen like Francis Marion and Benjamin Franklin, very much 18th century characters who come from a very hierarchical society, but who were in the 19th century made into everyman kinds of heroes. Benjamin Franklin spent his adult life trying to make himself into an 18th century gentleman. You know, he made a fortune in printing and publishing, and as soon as he could, he got out of that so he could avoid the taint of trade and become a true 18th century gentleman who didn't have to work for a living. But we remember him because we've been taught by our democratic forebears of the 19th century to think of him as an ink on his hands printer, as Poor Richard, and an idea, an image of himself he actually was trying to shed in the 18th century. We remade him. We remade him into a hero suitable for the heirs to a democratic revolution. The war gave us our opportunity to establish the world's first great republic and to begin the difficult work of fulfilling the ideals upon which that republic was founded: liberty, equality, natural and civil rights, and the privileges and obligations of citizenship under the rule of law. Embracing the idea that the American Revolution was a people's revolution compels us to consider the varied ideas and hopes and motivations of an enormous range of Americans, a diverse range of Americans from all walks of life. And it does something equally important. It forces us to view the revolution not from the perspective of the present, but in relation to what came before, the conditions of life before America was in any sense, in any meaningful sense, free. The circumstances that those people fighting for their autonomy were resisting. It leads us to judge the people of the revolution not by our standards alone, nor, this is important, nor by what we so easily call the context of their time, as if that context were somehow static, that it wasn't constantly moving, and that they weren't themselves changing the context of their time. It leads us to judge them by how their energy and their daring changed the world in which they lived for the better. And that's a fair and just standard against anyone can be judged. It is, in fact, the standard by which we should hope that our posterity 100 years from now will judge us, not by whether we fulfill their standards, but by whether we have taken the world as we found it and through our efforts, through our energy, through our daring, changed the world and made it better. Thomas Jefferson was being modest when he wrote that the Declaration of Independence did not express any original ideas, and that its purpose was, he said, to express the common sense of the subject, as it was commonly being discussed at the time. Now, Jefferson liked to be modest like that. He was disarmingly modest, which would, of course, turn people to praise him, to say he was being too modest, and he was good at that. But there was much truth in what Jefferson said. The ideas expressed in the Declaration of Independence were in common circulation. The originality of his work in those great words that have become the credo of our nation, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among which, not all, but among which are rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that latter a peculiar phrase, worthy of a whole another evening. The originality of his work was in the way he combined those ideas and expressed them in these specific words, which have led our discussions and our debates for over 200 years. But those discussions and debates about the meaning of our Declaration and therefore the meaning of our revolution and the obligations our commitment to those ideals impose on us, on each of us, those are the people's discussions. Those are the people's debates. They resonated with people in the Revolutionary War. They resonate with us today. They are our common inheritance. They should define our debates and our discussions and our plans and our dreams, our hopes, our aspirations for the future that we are making. They were such at the time, they have been since, and they are now, and they should be in the future. They will be in the future. Posterity, John Adams admonished us in the spring of 1777. You will never know how much it cost the present generation to establish your freedom. I hope you will make a good use of it. Our task here at the Society of the Cincinnati, the task of all patriotic Americans, the task, if I may be so bold, of everyone listening here tonight, our task is to make sure that posterity does know how much it cost the revolutionary generation to establish our freedom, so that in the future we can make good use of it.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Andy Morrison. I'm the Director of Development of the Society of Cincinnati here in Washington. It's my pleasure to be assisting Jack Warren with some of these wonderful questions that we've gotten. Jack, the one challenge with Zoom learning, I guess, is that you can't hear virtual applause. But if you could right now, you'd hear some great feedback and that was a superb talk, and I think all this group, from looking at the questions here, sees this as thoughtful a delivery as I know John Adams would as well. Now, the war lasted a little over 8 years, as you said. I think we only have a little over 8 hours worth of questions, so we'll pare this down a little bit here, and let me see what I can do with it. There's 2 or 3 themes in these questions that I think will be interesting to talk about, and let me a couple of them will deal with motivations, Jack, and they are interested. You've mentioned how this was very much a people's revolution, a citizens' revolution, some other scholars call it even. And some people are interested in any of the economic or mercantile motivations that whether it was the landed gentry or even the everyday soldier and the everyday citizen might have had as they looked at this war and the need for this drive for independence. How could you summarize that?
It's not easily summarized. We start from a good place by recognizing that people participated in the revolution for a wide range of reasons. It's impossible to characterize the causes of the revolution, not even a term I like, cause, but why the revolution came, the motivation that ordinary people had, wealthy people, middling people, shopkeepers, people on the frontier, people in the established coastal cities, African Americans, women. Why did they embrace the revolutionary cause? Each group, and indeed often individuals, based on contingent circumstances, have different reasons for the movement of resistance against Britain in the 1760s and early 1770s to resonate with them. They have as many reasons as you can count, but they come together. Those who support the revolution, who become, in the eyes of the British, rebels and radicals, they have come to the conclusion, for various reasons, that maintaining their connection to the British Empire, their subordination to the British Empire, is not in their personal or in their colony's interest. At first, they have no national conception whatsoever. They think only of if they think beyond their home, their family, and their immediate community, they rarely think beyond their colony. And that at first, actually, very few of the radicals, even as late as 1770, maybe a few, Samuel Adams certainly, are aiming at separation from Britain. Most of them begin, even the most radical, seeking independence. This sounds a little odd, independence within the empire. That is, for decades they had enjoyed. Remember that gentleman from Danvers, Massachusetts that I quoted? He said, "We had always run our own affairs, and they didn't mean that we should do so." He was grasping to the fact that for decades before the revolution, the British had engaged in this policy that we've come to call salutary neglect. The British had left the colonies to develop as they wished, and when they began taxing or attempting to tax the colonies, Franklin, who was in London as the agent of Pennsylvania and Massachusetts and New Jersey and different colonies, went before a parliamentary commission, and he said, look, he says, it's foolish to try to tax these people and incur all the expense involved. He said they're immensely profitable to the crown and to the state, that the commerce alone justifies it, and they are so loyal to you, they cost you nothing and are led by a thread. He says, don't antagonize them, was Franklin's message. They didn't care. They were haughty and they were arrogant. They lost America when they didn't need to. That's maybe, it moves on to a different question, but so many people were riveted by Britain's sudden, aggressive, and from their point of view, arrogant, if not tyrannical, imposition of regulation. It was frightening. It was a big change, and they resisted it for any number of different reasons.
Well, that's a good segue to a couple other questions that kind of come together in sort of asking the ultimate question to follow on to what you just said. Were they right? I mean, it obviously, did they need this fight to be able to get the autonomy that they really wanted, or was there a path that the American colonists have done better? Did they make the right choice? What do you think?
That's a big question, an important question. If I'd gone on for half an hour, that's the question I would have gone after. Because it's something that I think historians have gotten wrong. At least historians for the last 100 or 120 years have gotten wrong. You see, let me do really a thumbnail historiography, with apologies to any professional historians here, because this is the two-sentence version. For 100 years after the American Revolution, we had no problem making the British into the bad guys of the story. They were the black hats. They were, in fact, what the most radical of the revolutionaries claimed they were. They were tyrants. They were bloodthirsty. Mm-hmm. They were ruthless. They wanted to impose a tyranny on America, and they were set on it, and the revolutionaries rescued us from that. Now, what happened was, around the turn of the last century, and here I infer political motivations to my historical brethren, something I'm not hesitant to do even today. About 100 years ago, the United States and Great Britain entered into a rapprochement. We became, having been chilly at best for over a century, we became, since 1905, 1910, the closest of allies. And certainly since the end of the Second World War, we are as close as any two nations in the world. It really is hard for modern Americans, by which I mean 20th and now 21st century Americans, to imagine that the British were, in fact, a threat to impose a genuine tyranny on America. And some of the most brilliant historical writing of the last 50 or 60 years about the American Revolution, and I'm thinking here of the school of Bernard Bailyn and Mary Beth Norton and Gordon Wood and Pauline Maier, and some of the greatest historians of the American Revolution of my lifetime. Flowing from the insights of Bailyn in his classic work, Pulitzer Prize-winning work, The Ideological Origins of the American Revolution, Bailyn argued that the Americans of pre-revolutionary generation were motivated by an almost paranoid, he didn't use that term, Richard Hofstadter, a great historian, used that term, but almost a paranoid sense of a conspiracy against liberty, that the British were intent on undermining American liberties, that they were going to impose, gradually take away all American political rights, and impose a kind of colonial tyranny on America, and that ultimately this was unjustified. All the British were trying to do was rationalize what was, in fact, an irrational empire. And people like Thomas Hutchinson, Bailyn wrote a beautiful biography of Thomas Hutchinson, and Hutchinson can't understand why the Americans don't understand that the empire simply needs to be rationalized, and that Britain is, in fact, the source of liberty. It's the freest nation in the world. Well, it wasn't. I mean, let me become a good mid-19th century historian, which to some degree I am. We don't know that Britain was indeed on track to become ultimately the liberal, Whig-dominated polity that it became over the next century in the 1760s. The imperial reorganization of the 1760s looks an awful lot to me like the beginning of a tyranny. I mean, the British were not particularly gentle masters, say, to the Irish in the 19th century. What is it makes us think that wasn't going to be the fate of America? Now, see, the flip side argument is, oh, no. The fate of America was Canada. That if we hadn't had a revolution, well, we would have just become the dominion of the United States. And yeah, we'd have the Queen on the side of our quarters rather than George Washington, but we would still be living essentially in a liberal British Commonwealth today. And we would be like the Canadians. I'm not sure I believe that's true, because to believe that's true is to believe that the American Revolution has no real influence on the growth of liberal ideas and liberal democracy in the rest of the world. And one of the ways that argument gets spun out, this one fascinates me, is, you see, because the British abolished slavery in the British Empire in the 1830s, and it takes us a civil war and another 30 years for us to abolish slavery. Part of this argument, we would have been better off staying in the empire. Certainly African Americans would have been better off, because slavery would have been abolished in America much earlier than it was, and by peaceful means, presupposes that English liberalism, what leads to the great British Reform Acts of the 1830s, which makes England into a more liberal state, that the abolition of slavery, all of these things would have taken place without the American Revolution. And there's absolutely, in my view, no reason to believe that's true. British abolitionism was inspired by the events of the American Revolution. And it became, for decades, leading back and forth with the Americans in opposition to the slave trade and in the growth of humanitarian ideas about African Americans and the British and Africans in Britain and their rights within the empire. Yes, Britain can take the radical step, the right step. They can abolish slavery in the empire in the 1830s, but their circumstances are wildly different. And you ask a black Jamaican of the 1840s or 50s or 60s, was he a free man in the sense that that he believed that an Englishman enjoyed freedom? The answer would have been absolutely not. The path to freedom for enslaved people in the British Empire was painful and long, as it was painful and long for us, as long as it was painful and longer, in fact, in Brazil, where slavery wasn't abolished until the 1880s. And it was, I think, this is a contentious point, the American Revolution and its embrace, not its fulfillment, but its embrace and the principle of universal equality as a natural right through a challenge in the face of enslavement all over the world. It was a challenge that we didn't meet fully or well for decades, and that we haven't met fully today in many ways. But it was the fundamental challenge that began to change the world, including the British Empire. And so in that sense, I think, no, we wouldn't be better off if we'd tolerated what the British were doing in the 1760s, and they wouldn't be better off.
And that's a great segue to another question that's not surprisingly recurring in this when it looks at the recent discussions about how do we view history looking back at the past, and how do we look at the founding of America, and how should we evaluate our founders in that regard. And you said you started down this earlier in your remarks, because you said at one point it was important to understand the revolutionaries in their time and place. And you very much underscored the point about shared history and common principles being so critical to the country. But I think what you've just said a moment ago helps really answer, to summarize a question of what are our current thoughts about the idea of changing the way history is viewed and the way the founding is viewed vis-a-vis slavery, and the fact that so many of the founders or early Americans, as it is, were slaveholders. And you've gone a good way down that path to answer that question. So what would you like to add to that?
Well, I got a question at a different talk some days ago, and it was a present-minded question, and actually time ran out and we didn't have time to get to it, because as your audience now knows, I'll go on at length and then won't get to all the questions that people ask. And one of them was, I think, a kind of simplistic question, but worth talking about, which is, did the revolutionaries that I'm talking about, the ordinary revolutionaries I'm talking about, have a concept of white supremacy? And in other words, were they comfortable in their racism? And of course, that's a very anachronistic question. And what I mean by that is that, those terms, as racism as we understand that term, and white supremacy, are terms that would have almost no meaning to someone in the mid-18th century. I'm not being cute and I'm not being coy. In 1760, whites weren't supreme, not in the way we use that term, white supremacy. The king was supreme. Everyone, except for the king, was a subject. The aristocrats were subjects. They were the most privileged. And the slaves were the least privileged. They had none whatsoever. They were abused, and all of their rights, what we believe is natural rights, were denied to them. But keep in mind, there was no government in the world, not even England, with its vaunted rights of Englishmen, in 1760 or 1770, where anyone recognized the existence of natural rights at all. People don't have rights. They have such rights as have been conceded to them by a supreme monarch. And society before the American Revolution, this is true of almost every society in the world, they were gradations of unfreeness. Kings were free, and everyone in the world was ruled by a king, a czar, an emperor, a chief, somebody who ruled almost universally by hereditary right, by claim of hereditary right. And everyone else, their life could be measured by the degree of unfreeness they experienced. And there's something else that's important to understand. I've talked a lot in my talk tonight about the visceral experiences of ordinary people, about people being wounded and suffering and struggling. It's important to understand this is not just a condition of war. This is a condition of ordinary life in the 18th century. We have a sort of ridiculously genteel notion. I love Williamsburg as much as the next guy. I love the gardens and the pretty houses. You couldn't stand it. There isn't anybody watching tonight, anybody listening, who could stand living in that world in 1750. It was not just profoundly unfree, hierarchical in the extreme, it was violent. One of the things that defines us, and in fact, I think to our benefit, despite the violence that we've seen in our country in the last years, one of the things that defines us as modern Americans, as modern people, it's not simply characteristic of Americans, as modern people is an abhorrence of physical violence. It's hateful to us. In the 18th century, the middle of the 18th century, physical brutality was commonplace. In 1760, an English lord was put on trial for murder. He was the last English lord executed for murder, hung for murder in the 18th century. And part of his prosecution, it was brought up that he conventionally beat some of his servants with the side of his sword. He'd been killed ultimately, convicted ultimately of murdering a man and shot him in his house. But part of the discussion was how violent a man he was. And the royal solicitor on the other side, in the middle of the proceedings, as recorded as a trial transcript, it's fascinating to read, he laughs and he says, well, this violence, if we blamed a peer for hitting his servants with a sword or a cane, he says, every peer in England would be at the dock today. That's the natural thing. And this was true throughout society. A level of physical brutality was common that we would find grotesque. I mean, everybody here listening tonight has at some point read or heard the story of George Washington and the cherry tree, most great fable of American history. George barks. In the book, he barks the cherry tree, which will kill it. He doesn't actually chop it down. But he goes to his father and he confesses the deed, and his father embraces him and says, come to me, my dearest boy. You have repaid me 1,000-fold for the loss of my tree by being honest. To us, the generations of Americans, the hero of the story is young George because he's honest. But for Parson Weems, who wrote the story, the hero of the story is his father, because his father doesn't do what 18th century fathers do when their sons do something wrong. He doesn't beat him senseless. The father loves him and rewards him for being honest and truthful. That's just a tip of the iceberg. It was, in the middle of the 18th century, an English aristocrat got mad with Voltaire for writing some snide thing about him, sends his goons out onto the streets of Paris to beat Voltaire senseless, and leaves Voltaire bleeding on the streets of Paris, one of the most famous writers in Europe, for saying something unpleasant about him. He wasn't tried or accused of anything, indicted for a crime. This was normal. He was an aristocrat. Voltaire, how dare he? And many of we see their portraits. I talked earlier about the visual kind. We see these wonderful English aristocratic portraits. We don't understand that beneath that is a sense of entitlement and privilege and social superiority, class superiority of a kind we would find revolting. So slavery, and this is not an apology for slavery, make no mistake, slavery is a state which is only sustained constantly by violence or the threat of violence. It did not seem to many people, except for the most gentle and nonviolent people in the world in 1750, professing, serious, philosophically minded Quakers who abhorred violence of all kinds and who led the vanguard of anti-slavery. The rest of society was inured to brutality. It was something you saw all the time at every level. Apprentices were beaten continuously by their masters. People were branded, their ears cut off for what would seem to us minor offenses. And this is so-called free white people. So the revolution pulls the carpet out from under that world. It's going on in the 18th century, the end of judicial torture, for example, in Britain, and other things are happening which are ending these cycles and cycles of violence, but leaving untouched the violence which is the fundamental, which is the foundation of slavery, without which slavery can't exist. It can only exist with violence. And slavery becomes more and more anomalous at the end of the 18th century and the early 19th century, not just because it denies fundamental natural rights to one particular class of people, but it continues to expose one particular class of people to a kind of behavior, to a kind of violence, which is being gradually eliminated from society as society becomes more humane and more gentle in the early 19th century, but not for them. And this leaves slavery an anomaly in the Western world, which leads to it being such a hot political issue by the second quarter of the 19th century.
So I want to stay on this thoughtful theme for at least one more question, because another one came up that ties in with this. I think you'll like this a lot. And I've always found it fascinating, within just a few blocks of where we stand today, Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass, two of the most influential men of the 19th century, lived and worked and put their heads on pillows within just blocks of each other and blocks of where we are at this moment. And both those men wrote laudatory things, said laudatory things about founding fathers, revolutionaries, the American Revolution movement. Lincoln admired Washington tremendously. Douglass said wonderful things about him as well. So do you think, Jack, is there a commonality in any of the works and the writings that Frederick Douglass did in the 19th century that would have been in any way compelling to or aligned with at least the ideals and the hopes and the dreams of the men and women of the late 18th century?
No Americans embraced more fully the idea of universal equality than African Americans. And not having named any of the current polemicists by name, I'll go ahead and name Nicole Hannon-Jones and I have very little in common. She's the author of the principal essay that leads the 1619 Project, in which I have published on in a very critical way, because she misunderstands the American Revolution primarily. That's my quarrel with her. But she's right about one thing that's important, and that is that no Americans embrace the idea of universal equality as much as particularly black abolitionists She doesn't name that. She thinks African Americans in general, and I won't quarrel about that. But it's African American abolitionists from the 1770s and 1780s onward who articulate over and over and over again their commitment and insist on the nation's commitment to the idea of universal equality, to the idea that all men are created equal. And they keep telling us that over and over again. Now, Douglass begins, Douglass's Odyssey is one of the most fascinating in American history, but he says, of course, in his famous discussion of the 4th of July, what is the 4th of July to a black man? And that's often quoted. And that's often quoted as a rejection of the American Revolution, but it's actually, he's scorning the lack of fulfillment of that idea on the part of the American government. You owe this to us. We are entitled to it like all Americans. What is it to me? It may not be anything, but it should be everything. And Douglass doesn't let Americans forget its commitment to universal equality. And in the end, this is Lincoln's greatest importance to us. I'm not a Civil War specialist. We can debate, the details of the Lincoln presidency and whether the Civil War was greatly prolonged because of the way in which Lincoln handled himself as a war president. Some would say not. But Lincoln's intellectual importance is that he reminds us over and over and over again that equality is at the center of the American experiment. The thing that I find fascinating, among many things I find fascinating about Lincoln's ideas, is that at Gettysburg, Lincoln says, 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And when we hear those words, when modern Americans hear those words, our fathers brought forth upon this continent, and I ask you all, everybody listening, to think along with me and be honest. Aren't the fathers you are thinking of Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin and John Adams? And that's not what Lincoln meant. Not what Lincoln meant at all. Lincoln had written about our fathers before this, and he was inspired by his great sort of exemplar in public speaking, Daniel Webster, who had spoken repeatedly about our fathers and the Revolution. Most famously, one of the greatest orations of the 19th century, Webster's speech at the dedication of the Bunker Hill Monument, in which he spoke of our fathers bringing forth independence. And of course, at the dedication of the Bunker Hill Monument in 1824, the laying of the cornerstone, Webster was looking out at actually 60 veterans of the Battle of Bunker Hill, aging veterans of the Battle of Bunker Hill, there in front of him. Our fathers were the ones who gave us this great republic, this independence. And that's what Lincoln means when he says our fathers brought forth. He doesn't mean the founding fathers, those guys holed up in Independence Hall. He meant the people I was talking about in my talk, the ordinary people who made the revolution, who fought the revolution, were sacrificed. Douglass pays tribute to those people as well, but he wants us to fulfill the promise of their sacrifice. That's the challenge of liberal democracy. Now, let me say something about this, and this is more philosophical than it is historical. Indulge me anyway. One of the problems of a liberal democracy is that it empowers everyone, which means that it empowers the selfish, the greedy, the vicious, the sordid, the selfish, just as much as it does the wise and the virtuous. They all get to vote. They all get a say in the political process, and that means that reform is going to be often painfully slow. It is the ultimate vice of liberal democracy. You give everybody a voice, you give everybody a vote, you give everyone their due influence. You're going to have to fight an uphill fight. Max Weber, who entered politics late in life, regretted doing it. He says, I hate this. He says, politics is the slow boring of hard boards. Getting anything done just saps all of your energy And certainly for people who recognized in 1780 or 1785 or 1790 that slavery was fundamentally unjust, there were plenty of people who recognized that this was utterly inconsistent with the principles of the American Revolution. The politics of the next lifetime was the slow boring of hard boards. But the revolution had put this stake in the ground, and there was no retreating from it. There was no retreating from it, even if it was just a rhetorical device to justify a revolution, even if it was just that, and it wasn't. You've committed yourself to this principle, and now you're going to have to fulfill it, because we're going to remind you, and African-American reformers, and of which obviously Douglass was a leader, never let us forget. And Lincoln never let us forget. And their generation of men, William Lloyd Garrison and others who seeking to fulfill the promise of the American Revolution, wouldn't let us forget.
And that is a great answer, Jack. And as I said earlier, we've only had enough questions to cover probably 8 hours. And I'm not helping you any by going on for 5 minutes of crack. We probably ought to start winding down for the sake of our good friends in Raleigh. But I will say this. We've got at least the opportunity for 3 more series, because there's enough questions here to talk about the war in South Carolina and North Carolina and the Southern campaign in general. That's one that was prevailed through here, and that's a great opportunity for a next talk. There's a lot of interesting commentary as to the Native American relationship with the colonialists and how that early government went there as well. And then not to last but not least, a lot of good questions or interest in the veteran side of the equation. And of course, many of you know Jack Warren has just recently published a wonderful new book out just before the holidays called America's First Veterans, that is already the definitive story about the veterans, the struggle that our American Revolution veterans went through to earn their benefits and rights. And Jack's already got another good talk for that too, but we'll use that as a chance to save it for later. Thank you so much. And let me say that on behalf of President General Plus Lunger and Jack Warren and all the staff here in the headquarters of the Society of Cincinnati in Washington, this has been a real pleasure to be with you tonight. I am not in any way, shape, or form the closer. I'm going to leave that to our good friends in North Carolina. But I'll tell you that we have endearing respect and admiration for the North Carolina Society of Cincinnati. We truly value and are grateful for your partnership with the North Carolina History Center and Ken Howard and all the wonderful people that are there at the museum. And we look forward to doing this again. Thank you all very much.
Good evening. My name is Tony Maupin, President of the North Carolina Society of Cincinnati. In closing, I'd like to recognize the North Carolina Museum of History and the North Carolina Society of Cincinnati with their fine staff, along with the chair of this event, Stuart Dorsett, for organizing this evening's program. I particularly want to thank this evening's speaker, Jack Warren, for a thought-provoking presentation. As Mr. Warren mentioned in his remarks, we as Americans must never forget the fact that brave patriots fought, bled, and died to secure our liberty. We need those reminders today and tomorrow. If they're forgotten, we have little fabric to hold us together as our country moves closer to globalization. Future generations unaware of these historic sacrifices that secured our liberty will fail to value that liberty and sacrifice to preserve it, as stated by Mr. Warren. Thank you for spending this evening with us as we honor George Washington on his birthday week. Please stay safe, Godspeed, and hope to see you next year for our 5th annual speaker series on the American Revolution. Good night.